Welcome to the social-engineer.org podcast number 116. That deafening silence means that I'm all alone this time. Hey, we're going to try something new. Going to try just getting a lean, mean social engineering podcast machine. Yes, that rhymed, I know. Kind of goofy, but that's okay. We're going to try to just bring you the latest and greatest SE information and get right to the point as fast as we can by leaning out how we bring you the SE podcast from now on. Anyhow, with that being said, I'm really excited about this month's guest. It's Gregg Henriques. He is a psychologist that has come up with a unified theory of psychology, and it's quite fascinating. And it really is interesting because recently we've done a lot of talking and writing on our blogs and website about empathy and how important it is, and compassion and how important it is. Gregg really applies a lot of these principles to how it can help us enhance not only our personal security, but also help us becoming a better human race. So let's get Gregg in the podcast now. I have a great discussion about this. Okay, we are back with our guest, Gregg. It's really great to have you on the show today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. I'm actually really excited about this topic. On the podcast over the years, we've had a number of different psychologists come on and talk about their different theories and different things they studied over their careers, but never had anyone come on and talk about any new unified theory of psychology.
Well, there aren't too many of them, so that makes sense to me.
So you're unique.
I'm pretty unique. I'm sort of out here tilting at windmills, so to speak, but perhaps onto something worthwhile.
There has to be somebody that's willing to do it, right?
That's right. Either foolish or brave, time will tell, but we'll see. Maybe both.
They say that the brave are the ones who are willing to take the risk. So, I think if you're willing to take the risk to stand up and try something brand new, then you never know what happens with it. And even if it's just creating a lot of great conversation where people get to talk about something brand new, that opens up our minds to something different. This could be an interesting topic.
Yes. Well, I do think that I am onto at least a different perspective in a way of inviting people to think differently in a very big and broad way. And then we'll see how many folks follow that. But I look forward to sharing it with you.
So let's dive right into that. So let's talk a little bit about what it is that you started, this new type of unified theory of psychology. So that way we can let the listeners in to know just the basis of where you started.
The bottom line is that I am a clinical psychologist, meaning I was interested in doing psychotherapy in the mid-1990s. And then at that point, when I was getting trained, I got introduced to integrative psychotherapy. Integrative psychotherapy is the idea that there are these different paradigms of psychotherapy, which are models like cognitive or behavioral. They tend to go together in cognitive behavioral. Psychodynamic, that's the Freudian version. Carl Rogers, humanistic. There's family systems. There are a lot of different approaches. And I'm a big picture kind of coherent guy. And I'm like, wow, these are all interesting and cool. And they seem to offer key insights. But actually, when you adopt them as a perspective, then they don't really talk to each other in terms of their core concepts, even though they shine light on really interesting phenomena. And I noticed that that's a big difference in psychotherapy than, say, in at least traditional modern medicine. So traditional modern medicine is relatively integrated, and that is because it's organized around the science of biology and physiology and anatomy. So I got interested in this integrative psychotherapy question. And basically what happened to me then is I was like, well, how would we kind of coordinate or integrate actually across these paradigms? And basically my question, to boil it down, arrived at the idea that, well, maybe it should be based on the science of psychology. I turned back to the science of psychology and asked the question, well, what is psychology fundamentally? What is it about? What's its identity? And then I had a little light bulb moment where I was like, I realized, oh my gosh, nobody really knows what psychology is.
You have to go back to the very basics just to even start the conversation.
Here's a really foundational point that I try to tell people. And that is, when we started the Enlightenment project of the modern scientific enterprise, ultimately over the last couple hundred years, the modern scientific enterprise has been pretty successful, at least delineating a basic conceptual understanding of matter and energy, and then into life. So biologists are very clear about what their science is about. It's about the science of life or living entities and organisms. And although they debate about things like viruses, are they alive? And of course, we're not certain exactly how life emerges. Biologists know how to circle their subject matter. Same with physics, same with chemistry. geology, all of those things. But actually, when you move into psychology, what I realize is actually we don't even agree on what the fundamental subject matter is that our discipline is about. That's what I mean when I say no one knows what it's about. And that's what I ultimately call the problem of psychology.
Is that just because it's so complex, understanding the brain and the way it works, or is that just because everyone's got an opinion? Like, why is that the basis of the problem?
That's a great question. And the answer has to do with philosophy, actually, and our understanding of the universe and our understanding of the relationship between matter and mind and objectivity and subjectivity. Okay. So, in other words, what we don't have, what it turns out that we didn't have, is a basic philosophical, or sometimes use the word metaphysical, which is basically the concepts and categories you understand reality to be. And it turns out that we can adopt what's called an objectivist set of assumptions, meaning, hey, there's an objective or independent observer that's watching the way things behave. And that works pretty well for physics and biology. However, when you start to get into psychology, you start to get in the dimension of mental by definition at some level. And then what you realize is that there really isn't any good conceptual language systems or ways of carving up reality. Or let me just put it this way, there are a multitude of different competing ones, both in philosophy and in the actual enterprise of psychology, which actually combines sort of your conceptual understanding of your subject matter with some form of empirical method or enterprise to then learn more about it in a systematic way.
You're saying just even understanding or coming to an agreement about how we correlate reality to what's in our head.
Exactly.
We haven't even agreed to that yet.
For example, exactly. So psychology gets started trying to apply the scientific method to the mental. And at first, one group of individuals, most notably started by Wundt. Wilhelm Wundt is kind of the father in European psychology. And he thought that the best term for psychology was human subjective consciousness. In other words, your perceptual first-person reality. So he started the project of psychology to train professional introspectionists who were able to report systematically on one's first-person experience. And he brought people in the lab and he would show them things and he would try to deconstruct the structure of their perceptual experience. So he thought that was the science of psychology. Okay. William James over here, the father of American psychology, was like, no, I don't think it is that. The best way to think about psychology is sort of mental life. And by mental life, he meant really how do humans and indeed even other animals adapt to the world? You know, how do they solve problems? Why are they behaving in purposeful ways? How do they learn and adjust? What is the relationship between all of these things and conscious experience? So he was what's called a functionalist, whereas Wundt, although he didn't call himself it at the time, was really interested in the structure of perceptual experience. And really, James was interested in the function of behavior. And so you get that split. And then a decade or so later, or more depending on the exact time frame, but then you get two more big figures coming up with actually very different emphases. On the one hand, Sigmund Freud, and what his real interest is the unconscious or the subconscious, depending on how you, but basically, apart from what people are really conscious of and how they report and what they're doing, he was then really interested in what's behind that. What are the mental processes underneath consciousness? And in particular, how does that relate to stress and meaning making and worry and neurotic conditions? And then, of course, he develops a whole method of trying to treatment. So that plugs into medicine. And then you had the American empiricists like John Watson, who was a behaviorist. He rejected the entire concept of consciousness or any sort of mental causation and was saying that real sciences dealt with what is observable. And so he said it was all about stimulus and response and the behavior of organisms. So you had the behaviorists. So you really have functionalists and structuralists, unconscious, behavior. All of these terms are different subject matters. I can just label them and say, actually, you know, on a common sense level, they're actually talking about very different things. And that's really the history of our field, is that we don't have a system or have never developed a system that allows people to come together and draw a circle around the thing we call psychology. And that's what I'm proposing that I figured out a way to do.
Would those things you just defined be those four interlocking pieces?
No, actually, sorry. What I'm defining there is just making the point and trying to help all the listeners realize that actually psychology is at a much weaker place as a science. And in part, the obvious answer as to why that is that there's no shared language or agreement about what it is. What that does is that defines the problem of psychology. Yeah. And then your original question is, well, why? Why is it the case that we can't get our act together and talk about what it is? My answer to that is, well, we didn't have the right philosophical system. And that brings me to my first big piece. I developed a new philosophical way of describing the universe, basically, and carving it up. That provides a map for us to talk systematically about the topic that we're interested in. And that's called the tree of knowledge system. And that's the first and biggest piece of this unified theory of psychology that I built.
And how does it work?
The best way to understand it, if I'm talking about it, is if you're listening to this, to Google tree of knowledge system, Henriques, and bring up the graph. There's a depiction of it. So the easiest way to follow it is by watching the depiction. What it is you'll see it looks like 4 upside down cones. And what immediately jumps out at you is that each of the upside down cone is labeled. Bottom one is labeled matter. The next one is labeled life. The one above that is labeled mind. And the one above that is labeled culture. Okay. And you'll notice that it's on a dimension of time, that it starts with the Big Bang. So at the Big Bang, the universe resided in a state of pure energy singularity or some magical stuff. And out of that, what the tree of knowledge shows is out of that Big Bang event emerged what I call the first dimension of behavioral complexity, and that's the material dimension. That material dimension is made up of particles and atoms, molecules, and then organizes into bigger objects, ultimately like stars and planets, and it behaves on the dimensions of space and time. That's called the material dimension of complexity. And one of the novel insights about the tree of knowledge makes is actually what evolves over time. Well, after the matter dimension, there are 3 additional emergences of different dimensions of behavioral complexity, which I'll explain more if we get into it, but I'll just describe it right now. The first emergence of another dimension of behavioral complexity is life. Okay? And life emerges on planet Earth, as far as we know. It certainly could be elsewhere, but on planet Earth about 3.8 billion years ago. Now, why consider life a different dimension of behavioral complexity? It's like, well, biologists use very different language and concepts to describe living things than physicists and chemists do material things. For example, virtually all biologists use the language of information processing and communication when we're talking about cells and when we're talking about their organization. You certainly are likely aware that DNA comes in these parts known as genes, and these genes code for certain kinds of things. And we can talk about the letters of DNA and how they organize into particular codons. And those genes serve as a language system that the DNA system stores, and then it messages, and then it computes and translates. And really, the organizational level of biology really is an information communication processing system that has DNA and genes at its roots. And it's because of that unit of information and the way it's processed really gives rise to a meta level, a holistic level of processing that can't be reduced to its parts. And that's why it's a different dimension of complexity. And that's why biology is relatively, although certainly not completely by any stretch, but is relatively autonomous from physics and chemistry. And that's illustrated in the graph. So you go from matter to life. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's not something you commonly have as part of a discussion when you're discussing psychology.
It's not. It comes to become a very, very important point because the insight that they're actually a dimension of complexity transition from matter to life is commonsensical in biology and physics at one level, although it's rarely pointed out. But you'll see how important these distinctions are to actually get the language system of psychology correct. Because guess what we're going to do next? If it was the case that it was an information processing system and communication system that gave rise to the level of organisms, if we trace the evolution of organisms, we see that there's the emergence of yet another information processing system that actually pulls cells together so that cells then behave as a whole unit in real time. And we call that system the nervous system. And we call the creatures that are able to behave in real time as singular objects that do all the things that they do, animals. Every culture in the history that we've ever studied, that anthropologists have ever studied, make a big difference between animal life and plant life for the very obvious reason that animals do a heck of a lot of things that plants don't do, like mate, hunt, feel, for instance. Okay? So the tree of knowledge system says that just as the DNA cellular structure gave rise to emergent dimension of complexity we ought to call life, The nervous system gave rise to an emergent dimension of complexity that we can see in animal behavior. And it gives rise to this new concept, really. It's not available. So in some ways, it's kind of like a neologism, but I argue it's actually a word that we should be if we got used to using, our notions of mind and matter and how we make sense out of these fundamental philosophical difficulties would become a lot easier. So the tree of knowledge system says we should call the dimension of animal behavior mind. And that word, not the mind, but just mind, should be a word that we use very similar to the way we use life. You look at the plants and trees, you say, oh, look at all this life. And then actually according to the language system I use, when you see the bees, when you see the squirrels, when you see the deer, you're actually seeing mind in terms of this language system. And you can think about this in terms of cognitive psychologists or cognitive scientists often say, well, what is the mind in this case? Well, the mind is what the brain does. And well, what does the brain do? The brain actually coordinates the behavior of the animal as a whole. And what it does is it organizes the way a creature behaves. So actually, you are seeing the outside production of the nervous system, and that's why it's actually very legitimate to call it mind, if that makes sense. The inside of the nervous system and its informational structure, that can be reasonably referred to as the mind in some ways. But ultimately, what this system says is the dimension of animal behavior warrants this term, a third dimension of behavioral complexity, the term mind. I remember as sort of foundational concepts and categories. Well, what that does is it says, what I'm going to get to at the level of defining psychology is actually the base form of psychology emerges at this dimension. And what I mean by base, what the behaviorists were really interested in, and what were also the early branches of psychology were actually one very important that has faded, was what's called comparative psychology. Comparative psychology didn't mean we're going to look at animals and compare them to humans. Comparative psychology simply meant we were going to explore the mental behavioral processes of animals across the animal kingdom and compare them, not without any necessary reference point. So actually, the old version of comparative psychology is exactly what I think of as the base, the foundation of what I call basic psychology, which should be concerned with mental animal behavior as a whole, kind of what the brain does as a whole. This, by the way, corresponds directly to what B.F. Skinner thought of when he used the term behavior. My argument is actually what he was interested in as a special kind of behavior, what he should have called mental behavior. That's a different language, but actually it clarifies an enormous number of old conflicts. So all of the concepts like perception, learning, memory, all of the basic psychology concepts emerge in the animal dimension. Now, it's very important to note that most psychologists actually, in terms of, I'm a clinical psychologist, of course, I work with people. Most psychologists do work with people. And it's very important to note, what is the relationship between the animal mind behavior and the person? And this is where, again, the tree of knowledge sets the stage. Is there a big difference in the way animals and humans process information? And I would say absolutely, because look at what we're doing right now. We're talking. And so human language is another novel, emergent information processing and communication system. So whereas the nervous system pulled all the cells together and created an information communication system that gave rise to whole animal mind systems, now guess what? Talking pulls minds together and allows for what's called intersubjective communication. In other words, my subjective mind can now talk to your subjective mind in a way that other animals, of course, they communicate, but they don't have what's called an open language system. Okay? So human language is an open language system. It's a novel open language system that now connects things together at even a higher level of organization. On the tree of knowledge, you see yet another emergent dimension of complexity that's called culture. And what that refers to, culture with a capital C, that refers to all of the language, meaning-making, technically called justification systems that people build. And as you learn a language and become a fully functioning person, you learn your system of justification. And it is that the way in which you connect to other people and connect to culture, learn the whole history, and transmit information both within a generation and indeed across a generation. And it is that evolution of culture, that evolution of linguistic narrative across history that really is changing the way humans behave so radically differently than the way other animals behave. Not that other animals don't live very complex, rich mental lives, but they don't have cumulative culture that is mediated by language. And what that means then is human consciousness and human behavior is a very, very different thing. And so I actually argue we have to differentiate. To get this equation right, we have to differentiate basic or comparative animal psychology from human psychology. Human psychology is not is not a repetitive statement. It's not redundant. It is actually very, very key to recognize that the human mind is a very unique kind of mind and requires its own set of analyses and terms and a sub-discipline of the basic psychology. So that's one of the features of the system, is that it divides psychology up. The logic of the tree of knowledge says we have to divide organisms from animals, and we have to divide animals from people. And the definition of psychology is actually contingent upon both of those definitions and relations between those different kinds of objects.
So, trying to bring this to our field, which is, we don't try to understand how people make decisions, right? Because our goal and our job is to expose potential security flaws in the way someone might make a decision.
Yes.
So looking at these four things: matter, life, mind, and culture. So from a security perspective, we're probably not going to really get to that molecular level, right? Maybe not even the life, right, part of it. So it seems like where we're going to focus is mostly the culture.
You're really interested in human behavior, first at an individual level, okay? And so it seems, and then at sort of a group systemic level. Okay. And so what you want to do, my understanding of your social engineering, is you want to understand the kind of decisions that people make and why they make the decisions that they do.
Going to take a quick second from the show to just tell you what's going on in the world of social engineer. Well, let's see. It is now the month of April, so you have only a couple more weeks if you want to sign up for the Advanced OSINT for Social Engineers in Denver, Colorado. That class is about half full, probably by the time this comes out, maybe even more. So you want to get your slot in that class before we fill up. That is 23 through 24 of April in the beautiful Denver, Colorado area with Ryan. And if you haven't taken that class yet, you definitely want to get in there because it's an awesome, awesome class for anyone who's interested in corporate OSINT. We still got a few slots left in our Black Hat APSE class. That's 3 through 6 of August. You can head over to the blackhat.com site to check that out. You can get right to it from the social-engineer.com site too. And next month in May 13 through 17, there are just a couple seats left in our APSE class in the beautiful Bristol, UK. So there's all of our training options left for the 2019 year. Now, a couple other things to mention. DEF CON is in full swing, folks. CFP is about to be closed in just a few more weeks. The sign up for the SECTF is about to be closed in just a few more weeks. Some big announcements coming about things at DEF CON about to occur. So you definitely want to head over to social-engineer.org and check out all the things going on with our DEF CON SE Village and get signed up. Make sure you're there. We got 11,000 square feet this year, folks. So it's going to be truly amazing. Can't wait to see you out there. Make sure you stop in and say hi. Right around the corner, too, our final goodbye to DerbyCon. We'll be announcing some events that are going on there, hopefully. So stay tuned to the website for that. Let's see, what else is going on in the world of SE? Well, there's a heck of a lot, I gotta say, a real lot. So just go to the websites and check them out, social-engineer.org and social-engineer.com. Also, if you're interested, people have been asking, check out innocentlivesfoundation.org to get more information about our nonprofit and what we're doing there using our wonderful community to help unmask anonymous child predators and help bring them to justice using our good friends in law enforcement. And don't forget to check out our favorite band, Clutch, being so kind and allowing us to use their songs as our podcast music. With that being said, let's take a little listen as we get back to the show with Gregg. Would the culture part of that actually, in your study of psychology, like would it place a huge role in how those decisions have been affected? Like looking at one aspect of, let's say, present modern day culture, like social media.
Sure. My language system's a little complicated, but I think this will become really clear, especially because I think you guys have a background in human decision making. So according to my system, very consistent with modern cognitive science and human decision making. Human persons have really two systems of cognition that you want to be aware of. They have a primary perceptual, motivational, relatively automatic system that's oriented around basic emotions, perceptions, and it drives the investment of the individual. And what I mean by that is their basic energy expenditure toward and away from various things. And listeners can just look at their minds and say, hey, when you open up your eyes, you see perceptually the world around you. And you have actually, whether you're aware of it or not, you have immediate automatic responses that are either approach something because you tag it with positive affect, positive emotion, or avoid something. And indeed, when you size things up, like when you look at an attractive person, it takes you about 2.5 seconds to see that that person is appealing, way before what's called your secondary process kicks in. Now, your secondary process is your talking and justifying process. That is the process that engages in narrative reflection and legitimizing of choices. Humans are operating off of two different systems of processing, at least, but there's a basic primary process that orients folks, and then there is a reasoning process that's engaged. If you want to understand human decision making, it's very, very key to understand both of those systems and how they operate.
Okay, let's go through both of them. How do we understand?
Right. One of them is basically an intuitive system that has a sense for operating automatically. Like, for example, an intuitive system, somebody might be, let's say, afraid of airplanes. That's really largely the intuitive system that basically has evaluated all sorts of intuitive associations that say, hey, that's a really big threat. And then the justifying system might say, I know it's really safe. I know what the statistics are. And then they might experience a battle about whether or not they can get on the airplane. The justifying system would be, it's a lot easier if I travel this way. I shouldn't be afraid. Why am I involved in this? And then the intuitive system is like, I hate this. I want out. And indeed, they actually operate on different time scales. So when the person is at home and justifying why to his wife, and the wife says, hey, it's so much easier if we fly. And the person says, okay. The immediacy of the flight is not nearly as bad. So the intuitive system's not going crazy. But guess what? When you get actually up to the ticket and you actually are ready to check in, the intuitive system sees the plane outside and flips out and then runs away because it operates on a much more immediate and stimulus bound time frame, whereas the rational system is able to extend itself much more in time. Actually, that's how you get a lot of conflict between people's in their system, meaning that people who deal with dieting or addiction problems have this problem all the time. Conscious justification system says, oh, yeah, I'm ready to lose weight and I want to do all this. And if you're just starting off, that's okay. And then, 3 days later when you're really hungry and somebody presents you with a piece of cake, your experiential or intuitive system sees that as a good thing, remembers how good it tastes, and all of a sudden your justification system is pushed to the side and you find yourself eating the cake. So those are some kind of common examples. From a security perspective, this gets very much into what people discovered in relationship to advertising. In fact, John Watson, a lot of this is advertising goes back in what people really want to do in catching people's attention. They want to give an active stimulus that draws that intuitive perceptual system. And then they want to give a quick positive jolt that says, hey, here's a positive association. And what that does is it orients the intuitive system to pay attention to it and then to start investing in it, to move in that direction. Why did sex become such a big advertisement tool? Not because the logical system says, oh, well, because they're a very attractive woman, then I want to buy that car. No, it draws attention and then it creates a positive association and then sets the stage for that kind of narrative. So paying attention to the primary process system is really very important about how certain kinds of decisions might be made.
So is one of those systems more rational than the other, or is it just dependent on time and place?
It's a great question. It really depends a lot on time and place. The fast system is more vulnerable to making mistakes. That's definitely true. And by the way, if you want a really classic book on this, is by Daniel Kahneman on thinking fast.
I have that book sitting right here.
All right, well, there it is. At the cognitive decision making, he is the master delineating these two systems and the implication that they have for how people make quick, automatic framing decisions, and then how they actually engage in what's called effortful process and try to work things through. Adaptation is kind of complicated because you have to understand what your goals are relative to costs and benefits. To me, what I would want to say is the system one is largely an animal processing system. Okay, that's what we share with other animals, although we can certainly learn in some ways more effectively. And because we have this other system, the two systems feed back. But it's very helpful. And this is very important for me as a psychotherapist, because I pay a lot of attention to that emotional system and what we call the heart often in psychotherapy, and how people are feeling about certain things as opposed to their sort of rationality and the narrator. The narrator doesn't want to feel stuff or thinks differently than what the feeling system is experiencing, and they get a lot of conflict that way.
I'm a big fan of Dr. Daniel Goleman's work, and he talks about like when we get emotionally hijacked, I would imagine strong emotions could affect those systems in addition to culture.
The culture provides you what your justification systems are. So they give you the narrative, and then you're a narrator that decides, well, what does my culture tell me? When you're a kid, you just absorb what your parents tell you as authority. And then as you become an adolescent, then you start developing your own attitudes. But yes, the culture provides that. But absolutely, the primary process is this emotion. You get emotionally hijacked. Now, what we see, I mentioned, people get emotionally hijacked that are most vulnerable to this is that they don't really know how to relate to their emotional system. Okay. The proper way to relate to your emotional system is what's called the emotional sweet spot, or at least this is what I call it. So what you want to do is you want a narrator that actually is aware and attuned on the one hand to what you're feeling. You need to be aware and attuned because your feelings are telling you super important things. And actually your feelings are really trying to integrate your investment patterns, which is they're trying to give you information about the goals and what's working and what's not. Okay, that's what they're trying to do. And when things aren't going well, they tell you this isn't going well, and they shoot you with negative experiences to try to tell you didn't meet your goals. Now, what a lot of people, though, they hate them. And the secondary thinking system looks at the feelings and are like, I hate these feelings. And they try to avoid the feelings. So rather than being aware and attuned to what the feelings are saying, what they do is they block, they repress, they have what's called affect phobia, which is they actually have a secondary fear of the original feeling. So they block and avoid it rather than being aware and attuned to it. Okay. The awareness and attunement is one side of the sweet spot. The other side of the healthy emotional functioning is called adaptive regulation. So now these emotions, because they come from our animal world, in the animal world, they live in a very, very immediate time frame. So all of a sudden, it's fight or flight. It's a friend you want to give something to who gave back. It's a status competition, so you have to assert your dominance or decide to submit. It's nested in a pretty immediate stimulus response world, at least relative to the world that you and I live in. The world that you and I live in is enormously time extended, meaning that we have all these relationships and demands. So if I all of a sudden feel really angry, somebody cuts in front of me and I punch them in the nose, that's not ideal. Translating anger immediately into an aggressive response is not ideal. And indeed, actually, the most violent people on earth are 1 to 2-year-olds, actually. If you monitor aggressive action, 1 to 2-year-olds are the most angry or aggressive. If you hang out at a little preschool, nursery school, you'll see that they'll push each other and they'll bite each other and do all that. What does that mean? It means that we need to learn the adaptive regulation. In other words, you understand what the emotion is telling you, and then you integrate it into both your adaptive understanding and your short and long-term goals. Okay? So healthy emotional functioning means the narrator, that inner secondary talking part, is able to look at your heart and able to pull in awareness of what your feelings are telling you, and at the same time adaptively regulate it.
Way too many questions, right? Almost feel like it could be a therapy session, but then I want to bring it back to security.
Sure.
On one side, I could see where this can open up a huge discussion and potential vulnerability for people. This is exactly how people get hacked. You get an email and you feel emotionally vulnerable, you feel threatened, you feel afraid, you feel scared, you feel all these strong emotions. And like you said, you get angry at those emotions, so you want to repress them, push them away. So you do the thing that makes it go away. You click the link, you give over the information, you just hand over the password, whatever it is, and it goes away quick. Then later on, it's like, oh, gosh, I just got hacked. I can't believe it. And you don't realize it till later.
Right.
That realization, bam, this is how we're getting hacked. It's this emotional hijacking portion. But then how do we create the narrator? How do we create the narrator inside of someone that sits back and says, hey, man, that email, you need to chill out for a second and not react. I know it seems scary, but why don't we just take a second and think before we act? That can work on so many things. So you don't go punch a dude in the nose. So you don't click the link. You don't give over your password. There could be so many applications to it, but how do you create the narrator?
What the trollers are looking for are people who are sort of defensive and primed. They're hunting for perceived security. They're already feeling vulnerable. So their fight or flight system's already, if they want to do the threat-based stuff, they want to jolt them. I mean, this happened to one of my students. I guess it was a voice phishing thing. She gets a voicemail, oh my God, the IRS is coming after you. If you don't do this right now and send money to me at this address, they're going to get arrested. She comes all flustered, and immediately then it gets an emotional overload because she can't, believe that this is going on. And then I was like, actually, I can't believe this is going on either because this is not the way the world works. And she was like, oh, you mean this is an entire lie designed to jolt you. And she, as many people do, she struggled with anxiety. And we had been working with her to, in terms of her own professional development in other areas. But she was prone, if you get a jolt, and a number of people sit on an emotional system that's charged. So what you're asking is, yes, well, how does that narrator? Well, there are a number of things. One of the basic things is really informing the narrator so it can have the secondary process of asking what is going on. From a psychological, a more kind of, well, how do we cultivate an emotional, intelligent person? Okay, that's one of the things that I'm very interested in. What is it developmentally and skill-based wise? What is it required to create an emotionally intelligent person, if we want to use that frame? And I've actually developed a sort of just a systematic approach to mindfulness along that line. And it's called C.A.L.M. That's the acronym. And basically what it does is it's fundamentally oriented to teaching the narrator how to adopt a reflective and responsive stance toward the world around them that is curious, accepting, loving, and motivated toward valued states of being. Those are the principles. Of course, C.A.L.M, that makes the word calm. But what it does is it tries to orient that narrator to be curious, accepting of one's feelings, loving compassion towards others and oneself, and motivated toward valued states of being. And if you cultivate a particular state like that, your vulnerability to getting flooded by emotions and then trying to deny them, and then getting overwhelmed by them, hijacked by them, is much lesser, because what it does is it cultivates the integrative capacity between head and heart, and it allows for a state of awareness. And then if you educate that system, like you guys would do, and say, hey, these are the things that are out there, then the secondary system can go to its semantic memory. It's more regulated and activate its semantic memory and say, oh, that's right, I remember this now, rather than being somebody that's really vulnerable, needing perceived security, and then hijacked by the emotional system.
I love the idea. I'm fascinated by the whole concept of one of the issues that's been created, and I'm, soapbox moment, but don't want to get into a blaming thing on society, but with, let's say, with children in general, and maybe even with adults now, is this lack of compassion and empathy that has created a deficit in emotional intelligence, which seems to make sense. And blending that with your concept of having this calm narrator, that when we don't feel empathy or compassion towards other people, that it really makes it impossible to have a narrator that will be empathetic and compassionate and calm.
Society, in my estimation, is getting increasingly confused and increasingly polarized. And we're engaged in what my friend Edward Kroger calls emotional warfare. That's a concept I'm really interested in. Basically, what it means is as we get more confused, as we get more defensive, as we fear our own vulnerabilities, and our understanding of ourselves and our emotions and the world we live in seems more kind of crazy and chaotic, essentially by definition, that human animalistic vulnerable part will get more and more dominant, and then people will try to circle the wagons around their own tribe, and then they'll try to validate their own tribe and see the other as something less than human. That's how we actually then essentially legitimize our lack of compassion. Those idiots over there, or those people are crazy. It's a basic human tendency for a long time. But as our society gets more and more confused, I definitely think, certainly at least in the large-scale political arena, there are a lot of data that suggests that we are sort of decompensating in our capacity to create a calm narrative for a multitude of different diverse perspectives in a way that's sane. But instead, what's happening is, it's a lot of outrage, a lot of defensiveness, people talking past each other, no centered understanding, shared understanding of we-ness that allows us to unite around sort of common principles at first. If you don't have that, that's another big issue. So yeah, I totally agree. And that's all part of the CALM model, is to try to help people understand a sophisticated state of mindfulness that leads to emotional and social intelligence that enables us to understand how to create mutually rewarding and beneficial relational systems, starting actually inside with your heart, and then moving into dyadic relations, and then family, and then community, and then on up. And we've not been terribly successful at really doing that. That's one of my passions, is to try to help people learn.
Interesting concept, because I had the privilege of doing some work with Dr. Paul Ekman on nonverbals, and he had this concept that, not as a blame thing, but he had this wonderful concept that you're never going to stop children from wanting to play video games. The way that oxytocin and other brain chemicals are released as reward systems in video games is generally geared towards violent actions. He had this concept of, can we create a game that would release the same type of chemicals, but for the reward system would be for something positive. And it's just something he threw out there. And I know he's been working on it, but it's like one of these things, like what you just said, like this societal change, because I could see where each of us can work on this individually for our own calm narrator. I'm going to start using that phrase as our own calm narrator to build that. But that will only go so far if there's not a societal change. Like you said before, these internet trolls, if we can use that word, are looking for those who will be triggered by almost anything. And there's a plethora of them out there, right? There's no shortage of somebody who just wants to be upset about anything. There's people who will fight a cause that's not even their own. Even if we could build that calm narrator in ourselves, that's a great self-defense mechanism for security vulnerability, but only to the nth, right? It stops where the society line is.
You have to think at the level of individuals. You got to think of the relationships. You have to think about the large scale social coordination. And so one of the things I'm really excited about along this lines, and I'm paired up, like I mentioned, with a man by the name of Edward Kroger, who has a philosophy that he calls One Divide. And really one of the focus that's directly related to this is on helping educate people on what he calls emotional warfare. Emotional warfare is the term that people describes the tactics and strategies that people use to try to defend their states of vulnerability. So it's when they try to control themselves or other people to try to latch onto resources like status and belonging out of the core fear that they're not worthwhile, or that if they don't do this, they'll fall into what's called emotional desperation. So people are trolling. What are you really doing when you're a troll? You're getting the jolt of reward as you cut other people down. That's what the troll gets out of. It's fun for a troll. Well, why is it fun for the troll? The reason that it's fun for the troll is because, at least according to this theory, is that at least in part, there's very likelihood that he basically has sort of manipulated his inner structure, meaning he's vulnerable in some ways and is looking for people to be underneath him to make himself feel better. So by tearing down others, you get a jolt of power, which really compensates for an underlying sense of insecurity. In other words, if you were really cultivating your true intent, the argument here, it's very humanistic. The argument is actually, if we were good at cultivating people's true intent, the vast majority of people want to move towards the good, the beautiful, the true. Most people really want this. But what happens is people get injured. They realize the world's kind of tough. They grow up in systems that don't really understand. They see their own status come under assault and they feel vulnerable. And so then they get secondary gain out of the initial desire to avoid further loss. So you're like, oh no, I'm under assault. So how do people justify their assaulting others? Almost all of them do it because they view the world as attacking them. They're feeling threatened. They're trying to avoid further acts of loss. So really what emotional warfare says is, hey, look at people being destructive and ask, doesn't this come out of a self-protection mechanism that has roots in broken trust where people are trying to avoid emotional desperation? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. That is, as a clinician, I see that all the time. And so what he's trying to do is educate us. And now I'm part of this journey also. See if we could create a culture or understanding of what emotional warfare is and create a culture that says, recognize that people do this for a lot of reasons and not hate the person. But I want to combat or define myself against emotional warfare and reverse cycles that enable people to kind of realize their true intent, very much actually by that calm MO narrator, try to find that true, good, beautiful intent and create systems that enable that to flow. So I'd like to educate our culture and create a justification system around the culture that allows us to understand this concept of emotional warfare and realize that, we're chewing each other up in a way that I think is unnecessary if we got better understanding.
So it seems like the adage that misery loves company, that there's truth in that.
Mm-hmm.
With what you were just saying, when people feel bad, they justify making others feel bad. So they are in this tribe of people who feel like garbage.
Yeah, you can track this in a wide variety of different ways. But if you want to know the people who are most likely to, aggress, they're the people that have been wounded and lost status, and then they try to compensate for that and take their actions out. So they tear other people down. It's a way for them to get a sense of power, but it's really compensatory. And if you know how to look for it, you can see that it's really built around an avoidance of further loss rather than a positive movement towards really what you want to do. And this is another thing about his system that I really like, is that it makes a very clear divide between defensive avoidance types of behaviors and good oriented approach behaviors, and the very important distinction that I think we could be educated on between those.
It just makes sense in the idea that if you had that empathetic response, you would realize, okay, this person made me feel horrible, but I don't need to retaliate that way because, wow, look how horrible I feel. I don't want anyone to feel like this. This feels like garbage. I don't want anyone to feel this bad.
You do need to educate people also on what I call healthy blockers. In other words, people will attack you, and you need to be able to, if somebody trolls me at one level, normally I just ignore it, if I'm a blogger, so that's fine. But at the same time, you have to know status and belonging are really important. So we just need to teach people intelligent, healthy ways when you need to block against somebody else's warfare. So you're not sacrificing yourself to it. But at the same time, I morally commit now. I'm morally committed to not engaging in destructive emotional warfare, either directed towards myself or my family. And I invite others to sort of make that commitment. I'm not going to tear people down and be destructive in that way. That creates vicious cycles and ripple effects. And by the way, we have so much of it. I certainly don't think we need any more of it. That's for sure.
I can also see where it's a very hard sell. Stepping out of the security realm for a second, it's a hard sell in the sense because this is again soapboxy, but you feel like just even what you watch on TV, on the regular entertainment, what is promoted is revenge, right? So if someone does me bad,
Yep.
I'm going to go and wipe out their whole family, everything about them. And, it's like there's whole movies about this. Like, you insulted me, so I'm going to kill everybody. And it's glorified. We are trained basically that revenge or getting back or getting yours, don't let anyone step on you, that this is almost a human right. Coming back to like changing a whole cultural thought that we've been ingrained with over who knows how many years.
At one level, to really change the culture is a remarkably sort of grandiose kind of deal. I'll certainly admit that, and it's an enormous project at that level. I do believe that me and my colleagues are working on the ingredients on sort of what does this look like? How can we share it? How can we put stuff together and get an enormous number of people that will at least say, yeah, that's an ingredient that actually makes sense. What you're describing is what's called honor culture, and certainly honor culture. Many cultures are organized around honor cultures. And to this day, we also have, and actually many sort of lower socioeconomic classes tend to operate in honor culture. And that's, eye for an eye and revenge against any sort of insult. That's one way. There's also cultures of victimhood, where almost it's celebrated to be a victim. And, oh my gosh, can you be more outraged? And how oppressed were you? And all of this other stuff. What we are certainly trying to do, and what we don't think the social sciences have done a good job of, is helping people understand both the psychological and sociological dynamics that give rise to conflict versus unity, and then allow them to be harmonized. And we believe that the concept of emotional warfare sets the stage actually for the right level of education that scales up. And what I mean by that, it starts at the individual. Indeed, we invite people to make the commitment to attend to your own emotional warfare at your individual level, see it interpersonally, and morally make a choice, and then to explain people what's going on and how vicious cycles of destruction unfold versus virtuous cycles of mutual reinforcement unfold. And it's a huge task. There's no doubt about it. But we believe that, all the great things that happen in the world start with a couple of people and a dream and a few ideas.
I love it. And you know what? I'm looking and I'm like, wow, we just went for almost an hour. I promised I wouldn't have went that. I think we could have went for hours. This is such a fascinating topic. There's so many applications that are not just security, just from a human standpoint. There's just so many applications. I think this is wonderful. So if people wanted to find out more about your work, about this initiative, where can they go to find out about you and how they could take a part in this?
They can find me online, GreggHenriques.com. That basically collects all of my stuff. My current outlet in the social world is by blogging. That's Theory of Knowledge on Psychology Today. I am engaged in a number of conversations with a wide variety of different individuals, and you can also reach out to me at my email. That's henriqgx@jmu.edu. And this whole emotional warfare thing just happened over the last 2 months. In other words, I didn't know about it until really early December and sort of fallen in love with it ever since. And so that's Edward Kroger and the Philosophy of One Divide and the Theory of Emotional Warfare. And that's onedivide.com. You can check that out there.
I'm going to write all that in the show notes. onedivide.com. Excellent. One of the things we always ask our guests, people that listen to this podcast love to read. And for the last 116 months, we've collected a wonderful list of books. So it doesn't have to be about this topic, but is there a book that you've read recently that you really loved and you would recommend?
Yes, I just fell in love with this book. It's called Orders of Nature. Actually, if you PDF it, you can find it by a philosopher, Larry Cahoon. Now, I love it for my own unique purposes, and we didn't talk too much about, remember we started on the whole theory of knowledge? That's really what that book is about from a philosophical perspective. So I will simply say that. Another book that I would recommend, if you're interested like in the C.A.L.M MO thing, is The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion by Germer, Germer. It's called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. I'll recommend those two books, depending on which aspect of this conversation you found that you'd want to follow up on.
Both of them sound fascinating, so they'll be on my reading list for sure. Oh, Greg, this has been great. This has really been a fascinating conversation and something to give us all a lot to think about for self-improvement as well as security improvement. So I can't thank you enough for joining us and giving us all a lot of things to really ponder.
It was really my pleasure. I appreciate the questions and the time. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Honestly, that was an amazing podcast. And for all of you listening, I'm sure you agree. It was truly phenomenal. How we can build a calm narrator. Definitely going to be the title of this podcast because I just love it. And some things I'm going to be working on personally as I re-listen to this podcast over and over and over again. Well, if you want to, check us out on social-engineer.com or social-engineer.org. You can follow me on Human Hacker on Twitter. Our corporate is SOC Engineer Inc. And of course, Innocent.org for the Innocent Lives Foundation. Feel free to follow us on any of those mediums. Check us out on Facebook, LinkedIn, all the other social medias. Head on over, give us a good rating, even though it doesn't really seem to matter. But we like them anyway because it makes us feel good. And until next month, we'll see you.